My grandfather died on a Tuesday in early November. He was 81 years old and he died alone in a 2-bedroom house on 40 acres of Ozark Hill country outside a town called Sutter, Missouri, population roughly 300. The coroner said it was his heart, said it probably happened in the night while he was sleeping. I have no reason to doubt that, but I will tell you that when I saw the house for the first time after his death, every window was covered in heavy gauge wire mesh bolted to the frames with lag screws, and the front door had 3 separate locks on it, 2 deadbolts and a sliding steel bar mounted on the inside, and every single one of them was engaged. Whatever my grandfather was afraid of, he was afraid of it right up until the end. My name is Owen Macy. I am 28 years old, and I work as a carpenter in Topeka, Kansas. I was never particularly close to my grandfather. He lived alone in the Missouri hills, and my family only visited once or twice a year when I was a kid. My mother always described her father as eccentric, but harmless. I remember him as a tall, lean man with sun-darkened skin and careful eyes who smelled like wood smoke and moved through his own house like someone who was always listening for something. Even sitting on his porch in the middle of the afternoon with a cup of coffee, he never seemed fully relaxed. There was always a part of him that was turned toward the tree line. He was a retired game warden, spent decades working for the Missouri Department of Conservation, walking those hills, cataloging wildlife, managing the land. After he retired, he stayed on the property and became increasingly reclusive. My mother attributed it to grief after my grandmother died, and to the general stubbornness of an old man who preferred trees to people. She stopped visiting regularly about 10 years before he passed. She told me her father had gotten strange. She said the last time she went down there, he had the wire mesh on every window and would not explain why. And he had started talking about things in the woods that did not match any animal she had ever heard of. She said she loved him, but she could not sit in that house and listen to it anymore. When he died, my mother did not attend the funeral. She asked me to drive down and handle the estate. She said I could have whatever was there. She said it the way a person gives away a coat they do not want to put on again. I drove south from Topeka on a cold afternoon in late November, 2 weeks after the burial. The drive to Sutter took about 4 hours, the last 30 minutes on increasingly narrow roads that wound through bare hardwood forest and dropped into hollows where the light barely reached the ground even at midday. The gravel drive to my grandfather's property was a 1/4 mile long and overgrown with brush on both sides. No one had driven it in weeks. The house sat in a clearing at the end of the drive. It was small, plain, built in the 1950s, with the kind of practical simplicity that does not age, but does not invite you in either. The wire mesh over the windows was the first thing I noticed. It was the heavy-duty kind used for animal enclosures, the gauge you would use to keep a large dog from breaking through. It was bolted to the exterior window frames with lag screws sunk deep into the wood. Every window, every side of the house. I had the keys from the estate attorney. I unlocked the front door, all 3 locks, and went inside. The house was sparse but orderly. My grandfather was not a man who accumulated things. The furniture was minimal. The kitchen was clean. The bedroom was made up neatly as if he expected to come back to it. The second bedroom had been converted into a workroom. There was a heavy wooden desk, a gun cabinet holding 4 rifles and 2 shotguns, a shelf of field guides to North American wildlife, and a large topographic map of the surrounding area tacked to the wall. On the map, my grandfather had marked certain locations with small circles in red ink. I counted 9 of them, scattered across the hills and hollows within a few miles of the property. There were no labels beside them, no explanation of what the circles meant. On the desk, weighed down by a folding knife, was a single envelope addressed to me in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside was a short letter and a folded piece of paper. The letter read, "Owen, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are in the house. I'm sorry I was not a better grandfather to you. I had work that kept me from being the kind of family man your mother deserved. That work is not finished. I have left you rules. Follow them if you stay on this land. If you choose to sell the property, give the rules to whoever buys it. Do not throw them away. These are not suggestions. They are the only things that kept me alive out here for 30 years. I love you. I am sorry I cannot explain more in a letter. The land will show you what I mean if you stay long enough." I unfolded the second piece of paper. The rules were handwritten in my grandfather's careful block print, numbered 1 through 8. 1. Do not go into the woods after dark. If you are in the woods when the sun starts to set, return to the house immediately. Do not run. Walk at a steady pace and do not look behind you. 2. If you hear knocking on the walls of the house at night, do not respond and do not open any door or window. The knocking will stop on its own. It always does. 3. The creek on the east side of the property is safe during the day. Do not go near the creek after sundown. If you hear water sounds from the creek at night that are louder than they should be, close the windows on the east side of the house. 4. If you find animal remains on the property that are arranged neatly rather than scattered, do not touch them. Leave them where they are. They will be gone within a day. 5. The root cellar is locked for a reason. Do not open it between October and March. The key is in the gun cabinet. You will need the cellar in the summer months for storage, but check inside before entering and do not stay in it longer than a few minutes. 6. If you see a tall figure standing at the tree line at the edge of the clearing, go inside the house and lock the door. Do not watch it from the window. Do not try to identify it. It is not a person and it is not a bear. 7. Once a month, walk the perimeter of the clearing in daylight and check that the wire on the windows is intact. If any section is bent or pulled away from the frame, repair it that day. Do not wait. 8. You will hear your name called from the woods at night. The voice will sound familiar. It is not anyone you know. Do not answer and do not go outside. I read them twice, standing at the desk in the fading afternoon light. Then I put the paper down and walked through the house, checking the windows, the locks, the wire mesh. Everything was secure. I told myself my grandfather was an old man who had spent too many years alone in the woods and let the isolation build things in his mind that were not there. I told myself the wire mesh and the locks and the rules were the products of a careful personality that had tipped over into something less healthy after decades without anyone to tell him that the sounds he was hearing were just the forest doing what forests do. I did not entirely believe myself. The mesh on the windows was not installed by a man who was imagining things. The bolts were sunk deep. The wire was pulled taut. Every window, every side. That was not anxiety. That was engineering. That was a man who had identified a specific threat and built a specific defense against it, methodically, over time. I decided to stay overnight rather than drive back to Topeka in the dark. I built a fire in the wood stove, ate the sandwich I had brought with me, and settled into the front room with a book from my grandfather's shelf. The house was quiet. The woods outside were layered with the small sounds of a November night. Insects clicking in the leaf litter, the creak of bare branches in the wind, the distant call of a barred owl somewhere down in the hollow to the east. Around 9, something knocked on the east wall of the house. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate. Not a branch scraping against the siding, not an animal bumping the foundation. 3 distinct impacts, like a closed fist striking wood, at about the height where a person's hand would be if they were standing outside. I stood up. My first instinct was to go to the window and look. I was halfway across the room before I remembered Rule 2. If you hear knocking on the walls of the house at night, do not respond, and do not open any door or window. The knocking will stop on its own. I stopped in the middle of the room and stood still. The knocking came again. 3 more, same wall, same height, same measured spacing. Then a pause, then 3 more, but on the north wall now, further along the side of the house, as if whatever was knocking had moved. It continued for about 15 minutes. 3 knocks at a time, slow and even, traveling around the outside of the house. East wall, north wall, west wall. It did not knock on the south wall, which was where the front door was. I stood in the center of the room with my hands at my sides and my pulse loud in my ears, and I did not move. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was total. Not the normal quiet of a woods at night. True silence. As if every insect and every owl and every living thing within earshot had gone still at the same time. It lasted about 2 minutes. Then, gradually, the normal sounds came back. The owl called again. The branches creaked. The world resumed. I did not sleep well that night. I kept the fire burning and the lights on and sat in a chair with one of my grandfather's shotguns across my lap. The way I imagined he had sat on hundreds of nights in that same room over 30 years. Nothing else happened. The knocking did not return. The woods outside settled into their ordinary nighttime rhythms, and I listened to them until the first grey light appeared in the east windows and I could finally exhale. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the house. When I reached the east wall where the knocking had started, I stopped. There were marks in the wood siding, not scratches, impressions, faint round dents in the boards, about the size of a closed fist, grouped in 3s. Some were weathered almost smooth, barely visible under the paint. Some were darker, less worn. A few looked recent, the wood still slightly compressed and pale, where the impact had been. My grandfather had heard the knocking for years, probably decades, and every single time he had followed the rule. He never opened the door. I stayed on the property. I told myself it was because I needed to sort through his belongings and get the house ready to sell. That was partly true. But there was something else pulling at me, something about the rules and the wire mesh and the careful way my grandfather had lived that felt less like madness and more like discipline. I wanted to understand what he had spent 30 years doing out here alone. Over the next 2 days, I explored the property in daylight. The land was beautiful in the stark, spare way that Ozark country is beautiful in late autumn. The trees were bare, the light was thin and white, and the ravines dropped away into cold shadows where the leaf litter was thick and undisturbed. The creek on the east side ran clear over a limestone bed, shallow and quiet, the water the color of weak tea from the tannins in the fallen leaves. On my second morning, I found the deer. It was near the creek, laid out on a flat slab of exposed limestone. What was left of it? The bones were completely clean. No meat, no hide, no connective tissue. Just the skeleton, and it was arranged, not scattered the way a predator's kill would be, with pieces dragged in different directions and gnawed fragments left where they fell. The bones were placed in anatomical order. Skull at one end, spine laid out straight, ribs fanned on either side. The 4 legs positioned exactly where they would be if the deer were lying on its side. Every bone was in its correct place. The arrangement was precise, almost careful, as if something had disassembled the animal with patience and deliberation and then laid each piece down like a diagram. I remembered Rule 4, do not touch them. Leave them where they are. They will be gone within a day. I left them. The next morning, I walked back to the limestone slab. The bones were gone, not dragged away, not scattered by scavengers in the night. Gone entirely. The rock was bare and clean, as if nothing had ever been there. I started paying closer attention to the tree line at the edge of the clearing around the house. The clearing was roughly an acre, kept open by years of regular mowing. My grandfather must have spent hundreds of hours on a riding mower maintaining that perimeter. Beyond the mowed grass, the forest started abruptly, a solid wall of grey trunks and bare canopy. On the south and west sides, where the ground sloped uphill toward the road, the forest edge looked normal, trees growing where trees grow. But on the north and east sides, facing the deeper hollows and the creek drainage, the first row of trees was damaged. Bark had been stripped from the trunks at a height of about 7 feet. Long vertical gouges, pale scar tissue where the cambium had healed over. Not horizontal scrapes like a buck rub, vertical, running downward, as if something tall had reached up and dragged down with force. Some of the marks were old, sealed over and darkened by years of weathering, but some were fresh, the exposed wood still light and raw. Something had been standing at the edge of that clearing for a very long time, reaching up and clawing the trees. And my grandfather had kept mowing the grass right up to the edge of it, maintaining the open ground between the house and whatever stood in the dark at the boundary of the woods. I drove into Sutter the next day for supplies. The town was barely a town. A gas station, a post office, a general store, and a white clapboard church. At the general store, I met a woman named June Calloway who worked the register. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and friendly, and she recognized me immediately. "You are Earl's grandson," she said. "You have his jaw." She told me my grandfather had been well liked in town. Quiet, polite, always paid cash, never caused trouble. But people had learned not to ask him about what he did on his property. She said Earl came into town once a week for groceries and hardware supplies, always during the day, and always left before mid-afternoon. In 30 years, she had never once seen Earl in Sutter after dark. She said the older residents understood that there were things in the hills around town that did not have names, and that Earl had taken it upon himself to keep track of them. Nobody asked for details. Nobody wanted them. She told me about a man named Cleet Redding who owned the property north of my grandfather's. She said if I wanted to understand what Earl had been doing all those years, Cleet was the person to ask. I drove out to Cleet's place that afternoon. It was a small house on a gravel road about 1.5 miles from my grandfather's property. The house had heavy wooden shutters on every window, the kind with crossbars on the inside, and a porch light that looked like it had been running for years without being turned off. Cleet was on the porch when I pulled up. He was in his 70s, a former logger, built like a fence post, with the hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak he used to cut. He watched me get out of the truck with an expression that was not surprised. I figured somebody would come eventually, he said. Earl always said you were the steady one in the family. He invited me inside. The house was warm and plain and smelled like coffee and pipe smoke. He poured me a cup without asking if I wanted one and sat down across from me at a kitchen table that was scarred with decades of use. Cleet told me my grandfather was not crazy. He said Earl was the most careful, deliberate man he had ever known, and that everything on that property, the wire mesh, the locks, the rules, every bit of it, was based on decades of first-hand experience with something that lived in the hollows east of their land. Cleet said he had never seen it clearly himself. He had heard it. He had found the arranged bones on his own property twice, both times near the creek. He had heard his dead wife's voice calling his name from the trees at 2 a.m, 3 years after she passed away. He said it used her voice perfectly. The tone, the way she said his name, the little upward lilt she always had when she was calling him in from the yard. He said he stood at his back door with his hand on the knob and almost opened it before something in his gut told him to stop. He said Earl had seen it more than once. Earl never described it in detail, not to Cleet, but whatever Earl saw out there was enough to make him spend the rest of his life keeping it contained to the deep woods and away from the people who lived on the surrounding land. Cleet said the thing was old, older than the town, older than anyone who had ever lived in those hills. He said it was not an animal and it was not a ghost, and he did not have a word for it. He said Earl called it a cryptid because that was the closest term he had, but Earl himself admitted the word did not fit right. It was just the best he could do. He said it was intelligent. That was the part that mattered. It tested boundaries. The knocking on the walls, the familiar voices calling from the trees, the animal bones arranged on rocks like offerings or messages or provocations. None of it was random. All of it was deliberate. All of it was designed to get a response, to get someone to open a door, to step outside, to come to the tree line and look. I asked Cleet what would happen if someone answered. He said he asked Earl the same question once. Earl said he did not know because he had never been foolish enough to try. But Earl said he had found things deep in the hollows that suggested other people, a long time ago, had not been as careful. Cleet did not elaborate on what those things were. I did not ask. I drove back to the property in the mid-afternoon. The air was cold and still. I walked past the house to the hillside on the north side of the clearing, where the root cellar was dug into the slope. The door was heavy, reinforced wood, with a padlock holding it shut. Rule 5 said not to open it between October and March. It was late November. I stood at the cellar door and listened. From inside, or from below it, or from somewhere I could not precisely locate, I heard a sound, low and rhythmic, like breathing, but slower than any breathing I had ever heard. One long exhale every 10 or 12 seconds. Deep and resonant, felt as much as heard, as if whatever was producing the sound had lungs far larger than anything that should be able to fit in a root cellar. I stood there for a long time. The sound continued, steady and unhurried, the breathing of something that was not in a rush because it had nowhere to go. I did not open the cellar. I walked back to the house and locked the door and sat at my grandfather's desk and read the rules again, with the sound of that breathing still in my ears. That evening, just before full dark, I was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the clearing. The last light was draining from the sky above the western ridge. The tree line was going dark on every side, the trunks blending together into a solid wall. On the north side of the clearing, at the very edge of the trees, something was standing. It was tall, much taller than a person. It stood upright, motionless, partially screened by the first row of trunks. I could see enough to make out a shape that was roughly vertical, roughly the proportions of something on two legs. But the dimensions were wrong. Too tall by several feet, too narrow through the body. The top of the figure, where a head should have been, blended into the branches above in a way that made it hard to tell where the shape ended and the tree canopy began. Rule 6. If you see a tall figure standing at the tree line at the edge of the clearing, go inside the house and lock the door. Do not watch it from the window. Do not try to identify it. It is not a person, and it is not a bear. I stepped back from the glass. I locked the front door. I closed the curtains on every window. I sat in the center of the front room with the shotgun and the wood stove and the rules on the desk beside me, and I waited. The knocking started at 9. 3 at a time, measured and even, traveling around the outside of the house. It went on longer than the first night, almost 40 minutes. The knocks were louder too, harder, as if whatever was making them was putting more weight behind each one. I sat in the chair and gripped the shotgun and did not move. When the knocking stopped, the silence came again. That heavy, total silence where the entire woods holds its breath. Then, from the trees to the east, someone called my name. Owen. Clear and distinct, carried across the cold air of the clearing as if the person was standing at the edge of the mowed grass. And I recognized the voice. It was my grandfather's voice. The pitch, the cadence, the particular way Earl said my name with a slight weight on the first syllable. It sounded exactly like him. Not an approximation, not something close. It was his voice, the voice of a man who had been dead for 3 weeks and buried in a cemetery in Sutter. Rule 8. You will hear your name called from the woods at night. The voice will sound familiar. It is not anyone you know. Do not answer and do not go outside. Owen, the voice said again. The same tone. Patient, almost gentle. The way my grandfather used to call me in from the yard when I was a boy and dinner was ready. I sat in the chair and I gripped the shotgun so hard my knuckles ached and I did not answer. The voice called once more, then stopped. The woods went quiet. Eventually, the normal sounds returned. The insects and the wind and the far-off owl. And I sat in that chair until morning. The next day, I called my mother. I did not tell her about the knocking or the voice or the figure at the tree line. I just asked her why she really stopped visiting my grandfather. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then she told me the truth. She said the last time she visited, 10 years ago, she woke up in the middle of the night and heard her mother's voice outside the bedroom window. Her mother, my grandmother, had been dead for 5 years at that point. The voice said her name and asked her to come outside. It said it gently, the way my grandmother always spoke, soft and warm and patient. My mother said she got out of bed and walked to the front door and put her hand on the lock and was about to open it when my grandfather appeared in the hallway. He did not shout. He did not grab her. He just said her name quietly and told her to stop. He walked her back to bed and sat with her until sunrise. The next morning, he drove her to the highway and told her not to come back. Not because he was angry, because the thing in the woods had learned her mother's voice and he could not guarantee it would not try again. She said Earl was not keeping her away because he was losing his mind. He was keeping her away because he loved her and the only way he knew to protect her was distance. I hung up the phone. I sat at the desk for a long time, looking at the rules in my grandfather's block print, at the topographic map on the wall with its 9 red circles, at the gun cabinet and the field guides and the heavy locks on the door. I thought about the wire mesh on the windows. I thought about the mowed clearing and the claw marks on the trees and the breathing in the root cellar. I thought about 30 years. 30 years of knocking in the night and voices calling from the dark and a man sitting alone in this room with a shotgun across his lap, following his own rules night after night because there was no one else to do it. I folded the rules and put them in my coat pocket. I walked outside into the cold morning and looked at the clearing and the tree line and the house behind me with its wire and its locks and its decades of careful maintenance. I looked at the claw marks on the north side trees, 7 feet up, long vertical gouges in the bark where something had stood in the dark and reached down. Then I got in my truck and drove home. I did not sell the property. I locked the house, checked every window, and repaired a section of wire mesh on the north side that was starting to pull away from the frame. I drove back to Topeka and went back to my job and my apartment and my ordinary life. But I go back once a month now, always during the day. I drive down on a Saturday morning, and I walk the perimeter of the clearing and check the windows and inspect the tree line the way Rule 7 says to do. I mow the grass in the warm months. I check the locks. I look for new claw marks on the trees and I note where they are without writing them down. I do not stay overnight. I do not go into the woods. I do not open the root cellar. I keep the rules in my wallet. They are getting soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded. I read them sometimes at night in my apartment in Topeka, 4 hours away from the Ozark Hills. I read them the way someone reads a letter from a person they are still trying to understand. I am starting to understand why my grandfather stayed. Not because he wanted to live that way. No one would want to live that way. He stayed because someone had to. Because the thing in the hollows is patient and intelligent, and it tests the edges. And if no one is maintaining the clearing and checking the wire, and sitting in that room, refusing to answer when it calls, it will stop knocking and start finding other ways in, other voices to use, other doors to try. My grandfather understood that. He spent his life understanding it, and the cost of that understanding was everything else. His marriage to solitude, his daughter's trust, his grandson's childhood memories of a man who was always listening for something in the trees instead of listening to the boy on the porch beside him. I am not ready to move onto the property. I do not know if I will ever be, but I drive down once a month and I do the work. And each time the drive feels a little shorter, and each time the clearing feels a little more like something that was left to me on purpose by a man who trusted me to carry it. Last month, on my most recent visit, I was standing at the north edge of the mowed grass, looking into the tree line. It was mid-morning, bright, the winter sun pale and high. The woods were still. Nothing moved in the first row of trunks. The claw marks on the bark were there, same as always. The old ones dark and healed, the new ones raw and light. I stood there for a long time, and I had the feeling, the same feeling my grandfather must have had every single day for 30 years, that something just beyond the first row of trees was standing very still and watching me, not with hostility, not with hunger, with patience, the long, quiet patience of something that has been here since before the town and the roads and the people, something that has learned to knock in patterns of 3 and call out in the voices of the dead, and is simply waiting to see if this new one will be as careful as the last. I turned and walked back to the house. I checked the locks. I checked the wire. Then I drove home before the sun touched the western ridge, the way my grandfather would have wanted me to. The rules are in my pocket. The property is waiting. And once a month, I go back and I do what needs to be done. Because Earl Macy did not spend 30 years in that house just to have it fall apart when he was gone. Whatever is in those woods, it will find the clearing maintained and the wire intact and the doors locked tight. It will knock, and no one will answer. It will call my name in a voice I recognize, and I will sit in the dark and grip the arms of the chair and wait for morning. That is the inheritance my grandfather left me. Not the land, not the house, the duty, the rules, the understanding that some things do not go away just because you stop believing in them, and that the only thing standing between what lives in those hollows and the ordinary world is a cleared acre of grass, some wire mesh, and a man who knows not to open the door